In the summer of 2023, Arsenal agreed to pay £105 million for one player, Declan Rice, a midfielder, not a striker who scores 40 goals a season, not a global superstar with 1 billion followers, just a defensive midfielder. And yet, his transfer became the most expensive deal in the history of British football. Fans were stunned. Pundits argued for weeks. Was one player really worth that much money? But here's the question almost nobody asked. £105 million? To who, exactly? Because that number, the one printed in every headline, is almost never the amount that actually leaves a bank account. And it's almost never the amount the selling club actually receives. The transfer fee is the headline. It is not the invoice. Behind every 9-figure signing, there is a second deal, a hidden one, built from percentages, old promises, and contracts nobody remembers signing. By the time a player finally lifts a new shirt in front of the cameras, dozens of people have already fought over how that money gets divided. Agents, lawyers, academies, tax offices, insurance companies, even clubs that sold the player years earlier and still have a legal claim to whatever happens to him next. So, when a headline says $100 million transfer completed, that sentence is true, and also almost completely misleading, because the real number, the one that actually matters, is buried somewhere no fan ever reads. Imagine you run a football club. Your scouts have been watching one player for 18 months, not casually, obsessively, every match logged, every sprint timed, every injury studied. Your data department has compared him against 300 other midfielders in Europe. Your manager has already built next season's tactics around him. Everyone agrees, this is the player. So, you make the call. And here's the first thing that surprises new club owners. The number you offer is never the number you expect to pay. Selling clubs know this. The moment you show interest, the price starts moving. Not because the player suddenly improved overnight, because scarcity just became visible. If you want him, someone else might too. And the moment two clubs want the same player, the selling club stops negotiating from weakness. This is where football stops looking like a sport and starts looking like an auction. It's exactly what happened with Jude Bellingham in 2023. Real Madrid wasn't the only club calling Borussia Dortmund, and Dortmund knew it. Now picture the next stage. Instead of paying $100 million today, your club proposes a different structure, $20 million now, the rest spread across 4 years. To a fan, nothing has changed. The headline still says $100 million, but financially, this is now a completely different transaction. The selling club has to think years ahead. What if your club's ownership changes? What if your league suddenly cuts spending rules? What if your revenue collapses next season? Money promised for 2029 is not the same as money sitting in an account today. That's a simple truth most people already understand in everyday life. Would you rather be handed $1,000 right now or promised $1,000 in 4 years? Almost everyone would choose the money today because waiting has a cost. Prices rise, plans change, nothing is guaranteed. Football clubs think exactly the same way. That's why they almost never accept a payment plan without asking for a little extra on top to make up for the wait. Fans ask one question about a transfer. Can he play? Finance departments ask a completely different one. Does this signing bring back more money than it costs? Those two questions sound similar. They are not. Enzo Fernandez moved to Chelsea for over £100 million in January 2023. On the pitch, a brilliant midfielder. As a business decision, that's a separate conversation entirely, one that has nothing to do with how well he passes a football. That's why clubs today employ people who have never kicked a ball professionally and yet have more influence over a transfer than the manager does. People who study risk, people who study contracts, people who study money. Football decides whether the player is good enough. The business side decides whether the deal actually makes sense. Sometimes, those two sides disagree completely. Here's where things get genuinely strange. The announced transfer fee is often not even close to what actually leaves the buying club's accounts. Add the agent's cut, add the signing bonus, add legal fees, add payments to the academies that trained the player as a child, Add insurance in case he never plays a single match. Add currency conversion costs if the two clubs use different currencies. Suddenly, the $100 million transfer has quietly become 120 or 130, and the player hasn't trained with his new teammates yet. So if the selling club doesn't receive the full number and the buying club spends far more than the number implies, where does the difference actually go? That's the part of football nobody puts on a graphic, and it's exactly where we're headed next. In the next part, we'll follow a real deal from the very first phone call to the moment the contract is signed, and expose the hidden clauses that quietly decide who really wins a $100 million negotiation, the call nobody hears. Every blockbuster transfer starts the same way, not with a press conference, not with a private jet, with a phone call that lasts less than a minute. A sporting director dials another club. One question: would you sell him? 9 times out of 10, the answer is no. But no in football rarely means never. It usually means not yet, and not for that price. The first offer is almost never designed to be accepted. It's designed to gather information. If a club offers $70 million and gets laughed off the phone, they've just learned the real number starts closer to 100. If the selling club barely reacts, they've just told the buyer they might be desperate to sell. Every phone call is a negotiation wrapped inside a smaller negotiation. Nobody says what they actually want. Everybody is trying to find out what the other side actually needs. This is roughly how the Mbappé situation played out for years between PSG and Real Madrid. No official bid, no press release, just quiet calls, leaked rumors, and both sides testing how far the other would move. Then the agent gets involved. Fans tend to picture agents as middlemen who just find their client a new club. The reality is far bigger than that. A top-level agent can shape almost every financial detail of a transfer: how the payments are split, the size of the signing bonus, who pays the tax on image rights, whether a release clause triggers automatically or has to be negotiated line by line. One sentence from an experienced agent can move a deal by $10 million. That's not an exaggeration. It's why the most powerful football agents are wealthier than plenty of the clubs they negotiate against. Now assume a price has finally been agreed, $100 million. The deal is done, right? Not even close. Now comes the structure, and structure is where deals are actually won or lost. Let's say the selling club wants the full amount immediately. The buying club refuses. Instead, they propose a schedule: $25 million now, $25 next year, $25 the year after, $25 2 years after that. The headline stays the same. The financial reality does not. For the buying club, this protects their cash while leaving room to sign other players in the same window. For the selling club, this introduces risk. What if the buying club's finances collapse before the final payment lands? What if new owners refuse to honor old promises? This is exactly why selling clubs frequently demand guarantees or a slightly higher total fee to make the waiting worth it. Then come the bonuses. This is where a $100 million transfer quietly becomes something closer to up to $120 million. Win the league, pay another $5 million. Qualify for the Champions League, pay another $3 million. The player reaches 50 appearances, pay another $2 million. He finishes in the top 3 for the Ballon d'Or, pay another $10 million. None of these numbers appear in the original headline. All of them can appear on the final invoice. That's exactly why you'll sometimes read that a transfer was worth up to a certain figure, like Chelsea's deal for Enzo Fernandez, where part of the fee was tied to add-ons. That phrase, up to, is doing an enormous amount of work. It means part of that money might never get paid at all. And then there's a clause almost nobody outside football finance understands: the sell-on percentage. Picture a smaller club that develops a promising 16-year-old. Eventually, they sell him for $30 million, but before signing the contract, they insert one line: 15% of any future transfer fee. Years later, that same player is sold again, this time for $100 million. The original club, the one that trained him as a teenager, suddenly receives another $15 million without negotiating anything, without owning any part of the player anymore. One sentence, written years earlier, quietly created millions in future income. This is exactly the kind of clause smaller academy clubs across South America and Africa build their entire business model around. They're not really selling a player, they're buying a lottery ticket with much better odds than a normal one. By the time both clubs finally shake hands, supporters assume the hard part is finished. In reality, the most expensive stage hasn't even started, because once the ink dries, the transfer fee stops being one number, it becomes an invoice with dozens of lines, and that invoice is where the real cost of a $100 million transfer begins. In the next part, we'll follow the money after the signature and reveal exactly who gets paid, how much, and why a $100 million transfer can end up costing a club far more than double that number. Following every dollar, the contracts are signed. The medical is complete. The player smiles for the cameras, holding a shirt with his new name on the back. To the public, the transfer is finished. Inside the finance department, the real work has just started, because that $100 million doesn't sit in one account. It splits immediately into a dozen different directions. Start with the selling club. They rarely receive the full fee at once. If the deal includes installments, the money trickles in over years, not weeks. That limits how quickly they can spend it on new signings of their own. This is one reason clubs sometimes accept a slightly lower guaranteed fee over a bigger one spread across 5 years. Money today is simply worth more than the same money later. Whether they like it or not, football clubs are forced to think a little like banks. Next, solidarity payments. Almost nobody outside the industry has heard of these. When a professional player moves between clubs in different countries, a small percentage of the fee by rule has to go to every club that trained him between the ages of 12 and 23. Think about what that means. A small academy in a town nobody's heard of, one that coached a player for 2 seasons when he was 14, can receive a payment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars for doing nothing new, for a transfer they had no part in negotiating, just because, years ago, they helped build a footballer. For dozens of grassroots clubs around the world, this one rule quietly funds facilities, coaching staff, and the next generation of players almost by accident. Then, the agents. Their commission has to be paid by someone, sometimes the buying club, sometimes the player, sometimes it's split down the middle. At the elite level, that commission alone can run into the tens of millions. A single signature can generate a payday larger than an entire smaller club's yearly budget. Now the player himself. Beyond the transfer fee, there's usually a signing bonus. Not every deal includes one, but many do. A lump sum paid simply for putting pen to paper, completely separate from weekly wages. Then come the wages. A player signed for $100 million might earn another $20 to $30 million a year. Multiply that across a 5-year contract, and the wage bill alone can exceed the original transfer fee. Suddenly, the $100 million player is a $200 million commitment, and he hasn't played a competitive match yet. Taxes take their share too. Different countries tax athletes differently, and that difference alone can influence where a player chooses to sign. A contract worth $15 million in one country might leave him with less money in his pocket than a $12 million contract somewhere else. That's exactly why financial advisors sit in on negotiations that, on the surface, seem to be only about football. Then there's insurance. Spend $100 million on a player, hand him a $100 million contract, and you've created a $200 million exposure. What happens if he suffers a career-ending injury in preseason? That risk is exactly why elite clubs insure their biggest signings, the same way any company insures the equipment its entire business depends on. Finally, image rights. Today's biggest footballers aren't just athletes. They're brands, shirt sales, sponsorship deals, video game likenesses, advertising campaigns. All of it can be negotiated separately from football itself. For a global name like Mbappé, that side of the business alone can be worth tens of millions over a single contract. Add it all up, and the picture changes completely. The transfer fee, the agent commission, the signing bonus, the wages, the taxes, the insurance. The Image writes, that original $100 million headline was never the full story. It was the opening line of a much longer, much more expensive one, which raises an obvious question. If a single player can cost hundreds of millions once every hidden expense is included, why do clubs keep doing this? Year after year, deal after deal. That's what we're answering next. Why clubs keep paying it. Anyway, by now, one thing should be obvious. A $100 million transfer is almost never a $100 million transfer. Once you include wages, commissions, bonuses, taxes, and insurance, the real number can easily double. So why do clubs keep breaking their own records year after year? Because they're not buying a footballer, they're buying probability. The most obvious return comes on the pitch. Trophies, Champions League qualification, and Champions League qualification alone is worth an enormous amount. Prize money, broadcast revenue, bigger crowds for every home game, miss out on Europe for 2 or 3 seasons in a row, and even the biggest clubs in the world start to feel real financial pressure. One player can be the difference between qualifying and missing out completely. Then there's commercial growth, which is far less visible but often just as valuable. Sign a global name, and attention follows. More broadcast viewers, more shirt sales, bigger preseason tours, sponsors willing to pay more for a logo next to a player who moves the needle worldwide. When Inter Miami signed Lionel Messi, most of that deal never showed up as a normal transfer fee. It showed up in ticket prices, in a jump in global broadcast interest, and in a wave of new sponsorship money that had almost nothing to do with how many goals he'd score. Commercial departments aren't asking whether a player can score 30 goals. They're asking whether he can grow the club's audience on a different continent entirely. There's also the club's overall value. Football clubs are businesses, and like any business, their value rises with success, revenue, and reach. Spend $100 million today, and if it works, the club itself can be worth several hundred million more in a few years. Seen that way, an expensive transfer starts to look less like spending and more like an investment. But not every investment pays off, and this is the part clubs almost never talk about publicly. Football history is full of expensive signings that never worked. Injuries, poor form, a manager change halfway through the season, a tactical system that never fit the player at all. The talent was real, the results weren't. And when that happens, selling the player is often far harder than buying him was. His market value drops. His salary doesn't. Other clubs hesitate to take on that wage bill. The investment becomes something the club is stuck with, sometimes for years. Think of it like buying a house at the top of the market. The price you paid doesn't change just because the market crashed the following year. You still owe the bank the same amount. Football clubs face the exact same trap, just with players instead of property. This is exactly why some of the world's richest clubs still walk away from certain deals, even when a player is clearly good enough. It's not always about talent, it's about whether the club can survive if the bet goes wrong. That's also why modern transfers are no longer decided by one manager or one club president alone. Scouts assess the football, data analysts assess the numbers, medical staff assess the injury risk, lawyers assess the contract, risk specialists assess how badly the deal could go wrong, commercial teams assess whether the player can sell shirts on the other side of the world. Only when every one of those groups agrees does a club actually pull the trigger on a 9-figure deal, and even then, there are no guarantees. Football is one of the only industries in the world where you can do every piece of research correctly, spend months preparing, involve dozens of specialists, and still watch the entire investment fall apart because of one bad tackle in a preseason friendly. That unpredictability isn't a flaw in the system, it's the entire reason the system exists in the first place. If transfers were guaranteed, they wouldn't be investments, they'd just be purchases. So the next time you see a headline that reads, $100 million transfer completed, remember what's actually sitting behind that number: months of scouting, weeks of negotiation, dozens of hidden clauses, a structure built to manage risk on both sides, and a bet placed by an entire department of people who never touch the ball, that one player can change the financial direction of an entire football club. Sometimes that bet becomes a trophy. Sometimes it becomes a cautionary tale nobody wants to talk about a few years later. Either way, the match only lasts 90 minutes. The business behind it never really stops. The next time a $100 million transfer lights up your timeline, you'll know there's a lot more happening behind it than the number on the screen. If you want more breakdowns like this, the money, the strategy, and the deals hiding behind the biggest headlines in football, subscribe.